Welcome to Wine Soundtrack South Africa. Listen to the passion with which producers narrate their winery and their world. In 30 answers, discover their stories, personalities, and passions.
Hello, friends and listeners of Wine Soundtrack. This is Morena Kaler, and today I'm sitting with Jeremy Borg from Painted Wolf Wines. Welcome, Jeremy. Can you tell me a little bit more about yourself?
Morning, Morena. Well, firstly, as you can hear, I'm a fellow, and I'm in my 60s, so in my early 60s. Born in Johannesburg in South Africa, but grew up actually in Malawi and, what was then Rhodesia, Zimbabwe, and then tertiary education in UK, and then I went to the United States. I was a professional chef for a while. I had a little restaurant in Oakland in California, and I sort of then drifted into wine, initially selling wine. I worked for a broker in San Francisco selling small private wine producers who nobody really needed on their wine list. It gives me a lot of empathy for the people that have to sell some of my wine some of the time. And then I got a job in a wine cellar in Oakland in California at a place called Rosenblum Cellars, and I worked basically as a manual laborer. Stripped the floor, drove a forklift, punched things down, and then I went to viticultural college in Santa Rosa in California, and I was busy getting credits to go to proper wine university, and came back to South Africa in 1993 to visit my family at Christmas that year, and by accident went to work in Chobe National Park in Botswana, and where I met Emma, who is my wife, and we got married under a big acacia tree in the middle of the bush after a couple of years there, and that was where the seed for Painted Wolf Wines was sown. On our wedding day, rather late in the day after a very fun and very tipsy wedding, we made a pledge to one another to try and do something to contribute to African wild spaces and conservation. And that was sort of where, as I mentioned, where the seed for what we have eventually came from. I then went back to UK with her for a year, and it was actually a toss-up at that stage about whether I was going to pursue a career in wine or whether I was going to go back into restaurants. And I had a little trial actually at a very famous restaurant at the River Cafe. I'd worked at a pretty high level in food in California, and in fact they offered me a position, but the restaurant closed very late and I couldn't get home. And sort of more or less at the same time, I was offered a position at a wine estate in England called Denbies, and I started working at Denbies, and it turned out that Charles Back from Fairview had worked there when he was a young man, and the vineyard manager at Denbies wrote a recommendation for me to Charles, and before long I was back in South Africa. I was actually initially employed to be the assistant winemaker at Fairview. I was employed actually the same week as their current winemaker Anthony Diago was employed at the very end of 1996, but I ended up becoming Charles Back's boy Friday. And that was a very fascinating and very wonderful ride. Charles just had me do everything that he didn't feel like doing, meeting anybody he didn't want to talk to, and I learnt an awful lot about the South African wine business, or wine business in general, from somebody who is probably the best in this country, certainly. And whilst I was at Fairview, I did a postgraduate degree in wine business at Adelaide University in Australia. I was actually the second South African to ever have completed a tertiary education wine business qualification. Eventually I left Fairview, and I sort of accidentally started a wine consulting business. A couple of wineries needed some help on strategic things and on various bits and pieces, and I did some work for Klein Constantia and Hidden Valley and Oak Valley and a few other wineries. And anyway, one of my clients actually was the company that's now Stellenbosch Vineyards, and they sent me to UK to run their business there. but sort of more or less at the same time, we started making a little bit of wine. A friend of ours, she was actually the company secretary of Spear. She accessed a little bit of grapes for me, and I started making wine completely accidentally. It wasn't planned. My winemaking adventure would have been a lot more structured and organized if I had have planned it than it started off. But anyway, we started making a little bit of wine, and I got an order. And I was terribly excited. It was an export order to the United States. We made like 2 pallets of wine. It was tiny. And anyway, this is one of these South African stories. When I was ready to send the export order, I went to it was at the warehouse here in Stellenbosch. I went to the warehouse to pick the order up, and it had been stolen during the Christmas holidays. the warehouse had been broken into, and a lot of wine had been stolen. But anyway, the good side of it is that I got an insurance payout within 30 days of my claim being put in, and that insurance payout paid me the full retail value for the wine, which allowed me to pay for my second vintage, which we then sold. And that was called Borg Family Wines, that little project. But anyway, on the back of actually seeing that people were interested in buying wine that I made, Emma and I then scratched our heads and tried to figure out how we could turn that promise that we'd made to us way back when on our wedding day into something that would allow me to fulfill my personal ambition to make wine. I'd have been in the commercial side for many years, apart from those few years when I worked in the cellar in California, and then do something that would allow us to fund conservation and fund sort of the African wild spaces. And we scratched around for a while. It took about a year actually to find something, and it's what always happens with people that are involved in African wild dogs or African painted wolves. You get picked. You don't pick them, they pick you. And I was sitting in my little house. I mentioned that I was working in UK for this big company. I was sitting in my little house in England, and the letterbox opened, and Africa Geographic, which was a wonderful glossy magazine at the time, environmental magazine, popped through the letterbox, and there was a cover article about the reintroduction of African wild dogs into the game reserves of KwaZulu-Natal in the eastern side of South Africa, and it was captioned "The Natal Painted Wolf Project." Now, the scientific name for an African wild dog is Lycaon pictus, and Lycos is the Greek word for wolf, and pictus is the Latin for paint. So that's where the name comes from. So I looked at this magazine, had this incredibly enticing picture of this unbelievable animal with these really, really piercing yellow eyes and these big puffy ears and this little shiny red nose. He wasn't Santa Claus. He had a black nose, this dog, not a red one. Shiny red nose, black nose. Excuse me. It's this interview is going haywire even now. So I looked at it, and the name I found really intriguing. This really energetic name, painted wolf. Lots of really good energy, and I started to think, well, the name actually is what caught me initially. That was the thing, and I did a trademark search, and I found it was registrable. So I registered it immediately in South Africa, in the United Kingdom, and in the United States, which were identified as the sort of key markets for the sorts of project that I was looking to do. The initial project was crowdfunded. 13 friends dropped a few £1,000 in each, and it's a small crowd. and they get wine for the rest of their life. That's the deal. And then once we'd registered the name, I then wrote a business plan that envisaged a community-based wine business. The folks I worked for in California funded their business on this type of within this type of a manner. That business was run by a vet, and his funding came from people within his community some of whom gave grapes for equity. Some people worked in exchange for equity. The accountant swapped shares for his time, etc. And they built up a really great community. And the sort of Wild Dog Pack gave me an excuse to write this type of a business model. And my friends in California who I worked for, they gave a lot of money to all kinds of different charities, and not in a sort of planned way, and not very highly publicized, just in a kind of low-key way. And I saw that it really worked as a business strategy and a business model. I mean, apart from the fact that it makes you feel good to do that, and that you're actually spreading the love around. And I took this all on board, and it made a really big impression on me when I lived in California. And in fact, restaurants that I worked for were like that too. The restaurateurs were very socially aware and conscious of the community around them, and used their businesses to do good locally. And I really liked that. So I got the template with which to create this type of business structure, and we went ahead and we funded our business now on a more formal level, with a group of people who, you know, there was an expert at branding. There were 3 grape growers, an artist. You know, we tried to put together a community in a similar manner to the way that my friends in California had done that, and you know, that was sort of our Painted Wolf pack in essence. And off we went, and the business plan envisaged that we would donate money to conservation, and it was more or less from the get-go, more or less from the very first bottle. I think we probably sold about 10 bottles before we made a donation. But so yeah, that was the plan. The business was set up to fund conservation from now, forever. Yeah.
This is really interesting, and it's interesting hearing your story about your growth within the industry and lots of roundabout kind of ways that you ended up where you are today, and then obviously the African wild dog being your kind of base for what you're doing. They're incredible animals. I certainly love them, and I think the name Painted Wolf is so descriptive, because they do look wolf-like, but they've got these kind of almost watercolor markings on them, and you don't see them very often. If you go on safari, they're not animals that you really come across, but when you do and you see, they go often in very big packs, and they can be quite vicious as well, I think. But I love it. I love hearing where you've come from, and certainly what the ideals are that you are trying to achieve with this brand. Tell me, how many hectares of grapes do you work with? You don't you buy in grapes. What is the model from a winemaking perspective specifically?
Okay, so at the beginning, what I tried to do at the beginning with Painted Wolf is to create a wine template, if you will, or to create a wine brand that would allow my grape growers to get a premium for their grapes. And initially the model was that it would be the growers that invested in my company, whose grapes I would find a home for. It actually didn't quite work out like that. The very first grower who we engaged with, who is still a very active supplier of grapes to us, is a man called Billy Hughes, and he farms organically certified grapes, and he's got a little bit of a penchant for biodynamics as well, but they're not certified biodynamics, but he does follow some of the biodynamic principles in the vineyard. And I actually met him almost the first week that I returned to South Africa. I think I met him in January of 1997. I was invited to a wine tasting in Cape Town, and he was a guest there, and we became friendly. And I mean, he planted his vineyard as a copycat of the original Spice Route vineyard, which Ibn Sadi was the winemaker of at that time. And initially, he pitched his grapes to us when I was there with Fairview and Spice Route. But we had enough grapes for the project, for the Spice Route project at that time. So they got sold elsewhere. And I think in 2007, I bought the first grapes from him the year that we started Painted Wolf. And the very first grapes that I got from him, I paid for. And at that stage, the Painted Wolf project hadn't been seeded, because this week 15 years ago was the week that we actually founded Painted Wolf. So it was the middle of April in 2007 is when we received the registration papers for the company. So anyway, I bought those grapes, and initially they were for the other project that we were working on, and they then were morphed into Painted Wolf grapes. And so I've worked with him ever since then. Mm-hmm. His grapes are very highly sought after now and go into some of the most expensive wines in the country, actually. And then over the years, my other two growers, I had 3 shareholder grape growers. They dropped out. One of them, they sold their farm to somebody else, and it's in Klapmuts, and it went to a very big producer over there. And the other man, I stopped buying grapes from. I'm not going to go to why, but I just stopped. But over the years, I've started to develop new relationships with people. And what I try and do is, firstly, I try and work with nice people. That's my first and foremost rule. I don't know a huge amount about viticulture, even though I went to a viticulture college in California for a while, and I want to work with people who I feel confident are going to actually deliver to me what we agree. And I know that's not always the case, because weather can be a factor, but I want to work with people that are open and play open cards, and I am also interested in people who farm either organically or farm in conjunction with nature. Not all of our growers are organic. I mean, we have 1 or 2 growers who farm conventionally, but I'd like to work with people that are doing stuff the right way. I'm also interested in working with South African heritage vineyards, and we have a producer who has heritage vines. So yeah, and the other thing, of course, is that I make quite a broad range of wines, and they come from different viticultural regions. So I try to the best of my ability to find growers whose grapes are representative of what's best in the region that they are, and then do my best to vinify the nicest wine possible from those grapes.
That is that's always what we try to achieve, and it's interesting to actually, I didn't realize that you source grapes quite so widely, which is very, very interesting. Tell me, how many cases do you usually produce annually?
I think the maximum number of cases that I've sold has been, bottles is 240,000 bottles. It's rather less right now because we were hit badly with the whole COVID situation. We do a great deal of our business into the tourism sector in Africa, and that's been very heavily affected. So currently, I think we sell about 180,000 bottles. Sometimes I make a bit more wine than I sell.
Nothing wrong with that. I'm sure you can find an eager mouth to feed. Jeremy, tell me about your current range of wines, what will we find in that?
Okay, so Painted Wolf started out being, or my initial winemaking ambition was to be representative of the two really iconic South African grape varieties, that being Chenin Blanc and Pinotage. Pinotage is by far the most important variety that we produce in terms of the number of bottles we sell. And we've got Pinotage in 4 or 5 wines in our range. I also actually, and this is something that comes back to the days when I came back to work at Fairview. Coming back to Fairview and working in Fairview initially made me realize actually that we're working in, at least in Paarl and Swartland and places, in actually what are warm viticultural regions. And I have made it part of my sort of professional goal since I came back to South Africa to celebrate grapes and celebrate grape wine styles that come from warm areas. So I mean, I was very much involved in the conception of Goats de Rome at Fairview and those kind of Rhone type varietals, and I've carried on down that road. So what you'll find in Painted Wolf, you'll find basically 3 different ranges of wine. We have a range of wine called the Den, and the Den are comfort wines. They're made to be good examples of their type, but quite soft and approachable. And there's 6 varieties, but the ones that really count is a Chenin and a Pinotage and a Pinotage Rosé, and then there's a little bit of Sauvignon Blanc and a little bit of Shiraz and a little bit of Cab. And then moving on from that, we have a range of wines called the Pack, and that's a bit of a potpourri of wines, and those are the wines that represent the different regional regions that we work from. And so in that range, we have Roussanne, Viognier, Grenache Noir, Carignan. The most important wine, actually, and that is by a long way, is a Swartland Pinotage. I think we sell as much of the Swartland Pinotage as we sell of the whole other parcel put together. And then at the top, we have a range of wines that fall under the Lycaon Pictus. I mentioned to you that the scientific name for a wild dog was Lycaon Pictus, and the Lycaon range of wines are basically a heritage vineyard Chenin, a Grenache from a single vineyard, and a new wine, a Pinotage, actually from what I believe is the highest elevation Pinotage vineyard in the country. And although they're not old vines as such, the vineyard I think is about 25 years old, so a mature vineyard, and it's from a vineyard that has produced very highly rated Pinotage in the past for other producers. I'm very excited about having that in the portfolio. And then Pictus, the Pictus wine is an occasional one-off that I make every so often, and those are always a Rhone type of blend, so either white or red, depending on what floats my boat. So
it's quite a significant range of wines. I remember meeting you a number of years ago at probably what was the Joburg wine show then, and I think there were about 4 or 5 wines in the range. So it's great hearing about the expansion of your wines. You've traveled the world fairly extensively from what I can tell. Do you have any international wines that you've drunk that have really stood out for you?
Firstly, I love wine. That's I know that sounds like an oxymoron, but there are lots. I mean, my absolute favourite, and it's something that although we have the variety in South Africa, we don't do in the style. I really like Riesling from the Mosel and from Rheingau, and I just love so many different types of wines. I mean, I really enjoy wines from the Rhone Valley. I like Spanish wine, like wine from Priorat. There's so many different wines that I love. I tend not to if I am somewhere and there's an international wine list, I tend to steer away from Bordeaux wines and Bordeaux blends, and irrespective of whether they come from France or from Australia or locally. I don't know why. I like a slightly spicier type of wine, or either a lighter, more refreshing style of wine. So yeah, I like refreshing wine, and actually my winemaking style is wines that are perhaps slightly higher in acid and more medium-bodied than the wines made by a lot of my friends and colleagues. I mean, I was a professional chef, and I mean, it's just something that I gravitate towards naturally. Is wines that have freshness and that don't actually beat you over the head when you drink them. So
yeah. Taking into consideration the fact that you have worked as a professional chef, do you have any solid, hard and fast rules in terms of food and wine pairing, or do you think it's something that is more playful and experimental? What is your philosophy?
So I don't have hard and fast rules about food pairing. I actually think that a lot of the sort of more precise food pairing descriptors that are given on tasting notes and for wines are actually daft. I mean, in many instances, normal people can't cook those dishes. They don't know how to do them, or they don't have the ingredients. And I mean, where wine comes from traditionally, wine tends to be attached to a regional cuisine rather than to a specific dish. I mean, I know there are some real classics like having sauterne and foie gras together, and but in most instances, there's a spectrum of dishes that go with any specific wine. I mean, I do think that some flavors work better than others with wine, and but the other thing is that wine is a personal thing, and if somebody wants to drink a red wine with a salmon or something like that, that's your personal thing, So yeah.
Have you got any preference in terms of white wine, red wine, rosé, maybe some sparkling? What do you naturally turn to if given an option?
Okay, so funny enough, I like white wine more than I like red wine on the whole, I think. I mean, in our South African context, I mean, I'm seriously partial to Chenin. I think that it's I mean, there are some magnificent wines, magnificent Chenins produced locally. And I mentioned previously I love Riesling, and although I know that our Riesling isn't like German Riesling, I'm very happy to. In fact, last week I drank 3 different types of Riesling on different days. So I was having a little Easter Riesling moment. And then. I mean, refreshing red wines, I think probably rather than the more meaty ones would be my general choice. But once again, it sort of depends on the moment and what one is doing. And I mean, sometimes you just want to crack open a big Stellenbosch Shiraz that's a big monster, So, but yeah.
As the mood takes you, I agree. I did something similar over the weekend. I just said to my husband, I want to open a really special bottle of wine. And he said, what's the occasion? I said, just life. Sometimes that's necessary too. When you were little, what did you want to be?
A train driver, I think, initially. Actually, from a fairly young age, I loved cooking. I was interested in food, and from an interest in food, I developed a bit of an interest in booze, unhealthy at that stage in my life. And actually, I went to a fairly posh boys' boarding school in the bush in Zimbabwe, and when I went to the careers master and told him that I wanted to be a chef, he basically turned around and said, "Boys from the school don't do that." Right. So, and also my when I'd mentioned that to my father as well, he was not terribly excited in me becoming a professional cook. So I studied economics, and I worked for a firm of chartered accountants in the city of London, which was, for me, was dire. I mean, I was absolutely hopeless at it, and the office was in a little square box that looked out of the window onto the drain pipes that ran down this old building, and the building was owned by the Methodist Church. I got into a rather unsavory habit of drinking 3 pints of beer every lunchtime at the pub, and coming back and sitting at my desk and fiddling around with Tipex all afternoon, which didn't endear me to the partners of the firm. And eventually, actually, they did me a huge favour by telling me, actually just before I was about to sign a contract to do my articles, that I wasn't going to become an accountant. And I've scratched around for a little bit, and then I got a job actually working through a family connection at a very famous hotel in the north of England called Miller Howe, and it was owned by a guy called John Tovey. And at the time, Miller Howe, I think it was probably the only restaurant outside of South Africa that had an exclusively South African wine list. And this was in the bad old days when it probably wouldn't have been all that fashionable. But John had actually he had a kind of an interesting history. He'd been the personal secretary to the governor of Nyasaland, of which then became Malawi, and that's where the context came from, because I'd lived there. Anyway, Miller Howe had all the beautiful old South African brands in it and wonderful wines, and the staff in the hotel we used to eat the same food as the guests there, and with every meal it was a fixed price, a prefix menu every night with a 5-course menu, and each menu had a South African wine recommended with it. So I would drink something like a De Wetsoff Rhine Riesling one night, and then it would be a Rubicon, an old Rubicon, and then it would be a Zanfleet Shiraz from way back when, or we had KWV Cinso from way back when. They had all the sort of important and estate wines of the time. We're talking here in 1983, so way back when. And yeah, so I had a very fascinating time working in this hotel and drinking all these really wonderful wines. And then I went off to the United States, and I basically didn't taste South African wine until 1993 again after that.
Wow, that's quite a journey. Accounting, who'd have thought? Tell me, are you into music? Do you have any favorite genres, artists, bands that you enjoy listening to?
Well, let me say that I have, I think, about 600 LPs, more than 1,000 CDs, and a box or two large boxes full of cassettes. So the answer is yes, and it's actually been an obsession throughout my whole life. I mean, what really kind of intrigued me, and my mother loved music, and we had music playing in the house all the time. And she's a great classical music buff, and she's now 90. And if you go to my mother's house, she has music playing all day long, loud, classical music, Mozart, Verdi. So I grew up with this, and I guess when I was about 12 years of age, we went on holiday to England, and there was a band called T-Rex, and it was fronted by this guy called Mark Bolan, and I was enchanted and enthralled by this guy with his guitar that was shaped like a star, and he had glitter stuck on his face and lots of curly hair, and I thought, now this looks like a lot of fun. So I bought my first 7-inch single when I think I was about 11. I don't think I'd turned 12 yet, and from there it grew. So I like all types of music, not all music, because there's lots that's not very good, but I've got broad taste, which is how you manage to get so many records and so many things as well. I've more or less stopped buying now that I'm 61. I've got more or less everything that I need to listen to.
Very nice. So definitely an all-rounder when it comes to music. Jeremy, can you complete the following sentence? A table without wine is like.
Table without wine is like being in bed without a lover, I guess.
Empty. Empty, that will be. What sort of wines do you think will be drunk in, say, 300 years' time?
Oh, gosh, I've not given that any thought ever before. That's an intriguing question. I would like to think that, given the fact that table wine has been around as part of European and Near Eastern culture for 1,000 years already, that we would recognize what's being drunk in 300 years' time. But there's so many changes going on in the world that one really doesn't know.
It is difficult to say. If you were to end up on a deserted island, which 3 wines would you want to have with you to kind of help see you through the tough times?
If I went to a desert island, I think Mr. J.J. Proom would definitely play a part of my life with one of his Rieslings, probably dry. I could actually even handle some bottles of my Chenin Blanc, because they're quite refreshing as well. When you're on a desert island, you probably don't want to have wine, anything that's too complicated and stuff that needs to, So yeah, and then probably you need a red wine as well, just in case you manage to trap a wild hog or something, or an antelope and need something red wine with it. I think that my absolute favorite red wine, that's such a difficult one. I would probably go for something like a bottle of Chateau Castel, Chateauneuf de Pape, and maybe if I was to have a South African wine, I could actually handle one of my friend Chris Williams' Foundry Grenache Noir. That would be a nice one to have on my desert island with me. It's beautifully made, nice and refreshing.
Some really nice choices there, definitely.
Seems to have played quite a big part in that.
Definitely. I think there's a penchant for Grenache Noir that's coming through very clearly. Is there a winemaking region in the world where you would still like to explore?
Yes, I'd like to go to many places. I've been to a few wine producing regions. I've traveled quite extensively, but I've not done wine traveling. I've been to Rouen and to the Rhone Valley, and I've been to the Douro. I actually have an investor in my company that's one of the top wine producers in the Douro. but yeah, I mean, I'd love to go to Germany. I've never been to Germany to look at wine. I mean, there are other regions in France I'd like to go to. There's places in South Africa I'd like to go to. I mean, I'm a little bit of a troglodyte. I mean, I sit in my little cave in Paarl making my wine and not visiting my friends down the road. So there are many wineries and regions in South Africa that I could happily visit, I think, as well. So yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so I'm almost done. However, before we finish off, I would like to play a little game.
Okay.
I'm going to mention 3 varieties, and you are, since you are so into music, going to tell me which variety pairs with either a song or an artist. So, I'm thinking, since Grenache Noir featured so heavily, let's throw Grenache Noir in there, into the mix. We're going to have to add in some Riesling.
Okay.
And perhaps Pinotage to finish it off.
Okay.
What would you pair with those 3 varieties?
So, Grenache Noir. I think I'd do one of Van Morrison's songs. Jackie Wilson says. So I think that would be a nice one with my glass of Grenache Noir. Yeah, absolutely, lively and with some soul. Mm-hmm.
And the Riesling?
Well, the Riesling, I think we'd probably have to go to Mozart. Piano Concerto number 21, maybe. That would be a good pairing with Riesling. Yeah, or Haydn. I mean, the music that is fine and elegant and comes from the space.
Lovely. And then finishing off with Pinotage.
Pinotage, I guess. I think it would be. I was going to say it would be the right thing to pair something by a South African musician with Pinotage, so I think we'd have to do that. And a South African musician that I really love is Hugh Masekela. So I would enjoy one of Bra Hugh's records, perhaps one of the more jazzy ones rather than the pop ones. So I think we can pick a few different pieces by Hugh Masekela to go with our Pinotage.
Yeah, for sure. He was an incredible artist, for sure. Jeremy, thank you so much for joining us today. Would you like to remind our listeners where they can find you online, your website, and if they were to come to South Africa, how could they maybe come and see you and taste some of your wines?
Sure. So let's start with the quick one. We're at www.paintedwolfwines.com. Our tasting room is actually in Simondium, which is between Paarl and Franschhoek. We have a really charming, really cool new tasting room. The tasting room is actually sited at the building that housed the Drakenstein Wine Co-op. The building is now called the Simondium Guild. Drakenstein Wine Co-op was one of 3 wine cooperatives that were built in South Africa in 1906, and they were built basically after the Anglo-Boer War. Agriculture in the Western Cape was in a state, and it was decided by the government at the time that they needed to build some cooperative wine cellars so that grape growers could have somewhere to deliver their grapes to, and so this was one of the first 3. The other one, there's one in Wellington and one in Stellenbosch as well. And the tasting room was actually cut into some incredible old concrete wine tanks, and the finish of them is the original finish of the tanks. They were painted with a sort of terracotta coloured paint and then varnished with a sort of epoxy varnish. The floor is special, actually. we wanted to strip the floor down, and when we sandblasted the floor, what we got was a floor that has a different colours on it, so brown and a sort of yellowy colour, and it sort of looks like a wild dog's coat. So that was a really cool and interesting thing. So we have a very charming, very interesting tasting room. It's a bit tucked behind off the drag. It's one has to go sort of behind the building to get there. And we'd love to welcome you. And the other thing I'd just like to mention, whilst we're doing this, is that we as Painted Wolf, we've been donating to various conservation charities on an ongoing basis since we started, and it's been over 3 million rand to wild dogs. And then we do something called Children in the Wilderness, which does what it says on the box. It looks after kids that live in wilderness areas, and that's another quite a considerable amount of that we've donated. And our main thing is actually something called the African Wild Dog Range Expansion Project, which seeks to find wilderness areas that African wild dogs were formerly lived in, and then repopulate them with dogs. And it's a huge process. It involves actually getting male dogs from one gene pool and female dogs from a different gene pool, putting them in a boma, flying them to different. So last year we helped pay for the reintroduction of wild dogs to Malawi, when they haven't been there since 1956, I think it was the last ones. And so it's an ongoing rewilding project. And I was just watching David Attenborough actually on television yesterday afternoon, and he was talking about the huge importance there is from a global perspective of actually rewilding, protecting wilderness areas and rewilding them with the species of mammals and plants and etc. that were formerly in those areas as a way to actually make the planet sustainable again. The sort of, we partner with the Endangered Wildlife Trust with this, but the sort of umbrella partner or the umbrella organization is an organization called African Parks, and they are getting long-term contracts to rehabilitate important wilderness areas throughout Africa. And then our little thing just plays a small role in helping facilitate one of the species that's being introduced. So apart from trying to make delicious wine, that's what we do. Thank you very much.
A lot of noble efforts going into some incredible organizations to help assist, grow, change the face for the better. That's really amazing. Thank you so much for sharing all of this news and information, and for doing what you do for the African wild dog population. And yeah, I think it's awesome. Jeremy, thank you so much. It was a pleasure chatting to you, and goodbye to our listeners.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to a new episode of Wine Soundtrack South Africa. For details and updates, visit our website, wines.Painted.com.